All right.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of WCM Fireside Chats. I'm Brian Searle with Kara and Ben, who are our co-hosts. And this morning we have Jayne Cohen from Gorin+Cohen and like 17 other names that I can't remember, associates, right, Jayne? And they do like 25,000 things for campgrounds, all of which I can't name, but all of which they do really well, from what I understand and from what I know about things. So we're going to talk to Jayne a little bit today about development, how things are going in that regard as it relates to the virus, but also the economy and whether it's rebounding or not, and the increased demand of RVs and foods and stuff like that. So hopefully get some really good education process going on here, some facts from her, and some good discussion going forward. So Ben, are we live on Facebook? Are we ready to go?
Yeah, and you know, we're supposed to be joined by Bud Steyer, who's Wisconsin. He president of the Wisconsin Association of Campground Owners. He's also owns a few campgrounds, does a bunch of stuff in the development side of things too. But he hasn't logged on yet, so we'll see if he joins us here later. Sometimes that happens. I think.
All right. Yeah, we got, because the one guy, remember, he got the time zone wrong. And
yeah. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, shoot him an email and see if he's doing that thing. But so yeah. Jayne, I'm going to let Ben take most of this because he's going to ask the journalistic questions because he's a journalist. But just so you know how the things flow, I'm usually the negative person, picking up the counterpoint arguments. Ben is the positive one who thinks everything's perfect, and Kara's the smart one. So that's how we typically roll with these things, just so you know. Go ahead, Ben. You take the lead the way here.
Well, maybe Jayne can introduce her. Maybe you can just explain a little bit about what you guys do at Gorin+Cohen too, the consulting firm that you work with, I guess, just to start us off, maybe a little bit more of a description about what you do.
Okay, thank you. At Gorin, it's actually Gorin+Cohen Consulting Group is our name, Brian. And we don't quite do 25,000 different things, but we do specialize.
But you do a lot. And we
don't do 25,000
right now, so.
However, we do specialize strictly in outdoor hospitality. And we advertise ourselves as a small specialty firm. And all of our associates have pretty much spent most of their careers in outdoor hospitality, whether it be David, my partner, who was, as many of you know, was the chairman and the CEO of Arvik, and really was one of the founding fathers of Arvik, and has built his own RV park in Florida and has been consulting for a long time. And myself, who has, my family owned Jellystone Park in New Hampshire for 28 years. And then I worked for Adventure Bound as president for another 8 years, having 10 parks. And all of our associates have either had their own parks or been involved in marketing or land planning with RV parks and campgrounds. And I use the term RV park and campgrounds interchangeably. I am from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and in the Northeast or in New England, we typically refer to them as campgrounds rather than RV parks. So lots of times I will say that, but I really don't, I'm not trying to define them in any way by how I refer to them. The majority of our work lately has been doing studies for what we call new builds or new park developments. And it has been, prior to the pandemic, both David and I agree that I've been in this industry now 40 or 45 years. And I've never seen anything like this with the building of new parks or the expansion of parks.
Since the pandemic?
And, I'm sorry?
Since the pandemic or during the whole
for my whole career. I have never seen anything like this. And I think my partner David would agree. And since the pandemic, we have not seen it slow down. You know, there might have been a little blip there, middle of March for a couple of weeks, but we have not seen it slow down. Some of our developers think it's an opportunity, a buying opportunity. Others, these projects take so long and there's so much planning that the pandemic is not affecting them it's maybe slowing it down because zoning boards, planning and zoning meetings maybe are getting delayed, or things are working a little slower, like at the banks, that type of thing. But it's not squashing these new developments. They still, by the time they start their planning, they still, are a year or two out at probably the fastest pace to actually, get these parks built.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have a week go by where we aren't seeing one or two different projects, stories about one or two different projects, even in Canada, and maybe Kara can talk a little bit here about what it's like in Canada, but I know I've seen a few expansions or whatever in Canada, and I know like this morning I was taking a look at a story about one that's happening, I think, in North Carolina. So, do you see this COVID crisis slowing it down at all, or are they still pretty upbeat at the moment? And
I think what she's saying, Ben, is that the COVID is generally looked at right now as more of a short-term bubble, and by short-term I mean 12 months, right? But the development of parks is anywhere from, again, 2-3 years optimistic. I know parks have waited 6-7 years to get all their permits and all those kinds of things settled. And so I think that most people right now seem to be looking at it, from what Jayne said, as by the time we get the permits and we get ready to break ground and we get ready to open, that this COVID thing is more than likely going to be behind us. Is that true, Jayne? Or?
Yeah, that's my thought. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball and I can't predict the future, but that's what I'm seeing. The projects that I'm working on, we're still working. We're still doing our work. And our work is really, the bulk of our work is in the preliminary stage, when we're getting hired to either do a market and competitive analysis study, which then usually feeds into land planning and feasibility studies for lenders. And then we usually continue with those developers more on just a consulting basis to just guide them through all the different steps. And there's so many steps from start to finish, and there's a significant timeline. And it is what Brian just said, is that these things can go a year, they can go 7 years, they can go longer than that. It really just depends what the hurdles are. And I do think this year with COVID has slowed some things down, only because the things that they're doing, going to a planning meeting or having to even just meet with certain people who have been told that they can't come into work, so they're working from home, and that's maybe making it a little harder or taking a little bit more time, but it's not squashing the project. We haven't seen that. And I will tell you that we have, since COVID, we have had more calls and more inquiries on our websites than ever. And David and I have been together since like 2015 or 2014, but I can say since I started consulting in 2011, we have had more inquiries or leads about building campgrounds or RV parks since COVID. So, and I don't know if that's just because people are sitting at home and they see on Good Morning America about how everybody's traveling in an RV. So they are investing in apartments, and all of a sudden they think, oh, maybe building a campground or an RV park's a great idea. And they Google us and write to us. I don't know if that's happening since people are at home and maybe have more time to research things, but it is happening. We are busier than we've ever been.
So let me ask you this question, Jayne, just as an open-ended question first before I frame it into kind of my thoughts and opinions and stuff like that. Is there anything that you see besides COVID, or that is related to COVID indirectly, that could stop this development interest in the short term? What I mean by short term is by the end of 2020.
So obviously we have, prior to COVID, the economy was good. Manufacturers were shipping RVs at record pace. Even though RV shipments have been down the past couple of years, they were still record-setting years, right?
Yep.
Campgrounds were reporting every year double-digit occupancy increases. Even campgrounds that I would say that weren't the nicest campgrounds in the country were still seeing increases in their occupancy, not in their revenues, increases in real occupancy numbers, so site nights. They were also seeing, we're seeing more people than ever living in RVs, or I call it RV life, full-time RVers that are, and it's not just the baby boomers who were retiring and traveling around in RVs, which is what kept camping in business in the past, but we are seeing the new generations embracing camping. And it's really, in my mind, a perfect storm, you know, between the RV dealers selling more RVs, and they're all complaining that their inventories are short and they can't get inventory now. Between more people embracing camping, and I think there's a real opportunity for the campground industry right now to get new campers that have never camped with us before. And, you know, I see examples of it. I've seen some of my friends who, you know, jokingly always would say, what do you do? Campgrounds? You know, they would never go to a campground. They would never camp. And I've just had 2 friends go out and buy big coaches. And because, you know, mainly because the wives don't want to get on a plane. They don't want to go to a hotel. And, you know, they don't want to catch COVID, but they still want a vacation. So I am really in life seeing what they're saying is happening in the studies and the research, that there's this whole new market out there of folks that never even thought about camping before, and now are thinking about it, because even after COVID, and even after we find a vaccine and we all, you know, can take our masks off, people are still going to be worried about catching anything. I know I am. And I think we're going to have a different attitude. And I think that's going to help camping. And what I believe is that these folks that are, and I'm going to use my friends as an example, my friends that are buying coaches and getting out there and camping for the first time, they want to go to a place that has beautiful restrooms and nice sites, and that's very clean, and that has some space for them, you know, from their neighbors and so forth. Because these really are, they're COVID campers. They're people that came out of COVID that are camping. And I think they're going to have a different idea of what they want than someone who's maybe camped for all these years. And I do think that with all the RVs that have been sold in the past few years at record sales, these folks are looking for modern campsites. And modern doesn't necessarily mean luxury or fancy, but they want modern conveniences. You know, like Wi-Fi, for instance. It's really not an option to not offer good Wi-Fi at your park anymore, right? We would all, I think, agree with that. People want that. It's like, you know, it's like wanting the bathroom. I mean, Wi-Fi is something that is, you're expected to have Wi-Fi. And so it's those type of things. And I've always been a firm believer that if the basics aren't really solid, folks don't really care about the other stuff. So in other words, if, you know, if they don't have clean restrooms, if they don't have enough electricity to run their rig, if they don't have good Wi-Fi, then, you know, having a fancy pool isn't, you know, they're going to still be unhappy, because they got to have the basics have to be good, the basic stuff.
Yeah, so I'm 100% with you. I agree with you that there are very few things, if anything, that can slow down the campground industry, but specifically as it relates to development, which is more tied to finance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something short-term that could impact development specifically of new parks.
That, okay. Banking, investors, the lenders have always been a hurdle. And you really have to have to build a new RV park, you have to have the financial strength to do it. You know, you're going to have the capital to sink into the park. But there are lenders out there that are lending money. And I will say that there has been delays in that, you know, with all the PPP loans and the SBA loans and everything going on with that. The banks and the low interest rates and people refinancing, the banks are overburdened right now, most of them. They're very, very busy. So that's slowed down. But typically, many of these folks that are developing are finding private investors or have investment groups. They have relationships already with lenders, family, friends, and those, we're seeing that type of investment. And also, I don't believe you should discount your local banks, because if you are building, or your community banks, because if you're building in a specific community, your banks there in that community understand the area and understand what the demand could be in that area. And that is why the preliminary planning and things like a market and competitive analysis report and a feasibility report is very, very important, because that will help the lender understand the market and understand the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all good stuff. I think David Gorin, your partner, wanted to mention a few things. David, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Jane. Good morning.
Good morning, David.
Sort of responding to Brian, in order to understand, I think, what's happening in the industry, aside from the RV sales and the great interest in camping, is you have to go back to the recession of 2008, 2009, 2010.
Okay.
And since that time, developers and investors in real estate coming out of the recession had very little to do. Nobody was building shopping centers back then. Nobody was building housing developments. And as the time went by, developers need to develop, investors need to invest. And the folks we started hearing from had no background at all and no understanding of RV parks or campgrounds. But they were developers and they needed to do something. They were sitting on either property they bought prior to the recession, or they knew of where there was property available at prices that before the recession were untouchable. And getting closer into the cities or into major metropolitan areas became an option. And so as time went by after the recession, starting in 2014-15, when RV sales started to really go up and real estate was still in the doldrums in terms of building new stuff, these guys kept looking for what else are we going to do? And the more articles that appeared in the Wall Street Journal and other places, all of a sudden, RV park development and the use of land for that purpose became an alternative that these folks had never ever thought of. And so as those years went by, and if you look at the statistics starting from 2014 to 2019, 2015 to 2019, RV sales in those 5-year periods were over 2 million. And that, combined with the available real estate, opened up a new opportunity for folks who developed but had never ever thought about it. And people who own campgrounds, the big companies, very, very rarely looked at new development. ELS, Sun in the last couple of years has now started developing some new stuff. But ELS, KOA has never built their own parks. There's a certain thing, it takes a certain kind of person to be a developer, to buy raw land and develop it and invest in it. And they look at the long-term returns. And as the industry grew from 2015 to today, that interest was always there. I think the COVID thing, as Jayne said, just stalled things a little bit for a couple of months back in, I guess, March, April. And now people are getting back interested in it because of all the PR, the coverage on news is all over the place. So that's really where it happened. And I think that the folks who are really real estate developers and who own property, when COVID comes, starts to hopefully change, they're going to be right back there in the market because that's their business. What else are they going to do? So that's really, I think, what is from the developer side, what they're doing. And a lot of these guys, financing is important, but they're developers, they've had the connections, and they figure out how to do that.
So I agree with all of that, and we saw the same pattern with our company. We've been in the industry since 2011, 2010. But my question more so pointedly is do you feel like there's a danger if the economy were to not recover as fast as some people are predicting, that liquidity and the lack of understanding of our industry still might be a barrier to future development?
I don't see that. No, I really don't. I think that there has to be the economy is not going to die entirely, for sure.
Great.
And it will still be there. There are two things that really can drive this industry and has on the RV side and on the camping side. One, your kids are only young once. You can only have them from, before they become teenagers. And then that's much more difficult after that time. That's one thing. So there's always more families coming. And two, you only get one retirement. And if you really were looking at wanting to do something and travel during your retirement, you only get one shot at it. So that's, the recession stalled a lot of those people. So when the recession ended, they jumped right back into the market. And the same thing now when COVID ends, or if it does, those two factors are continue to drive the industry. And I don't think they're going away. So I think right now the industry has moved, when Jayne and Jayne goes back a lot longer somewhat than I do, but even when I got involved in the industry in 1987, people who bought RVs were kind of folks who marched to their own drama. They were a little bit eccentric. It wasn't mainstream kind of thing to do. And go RVing, since it started in 1994, 95, 96, whenever that was, has just moved that needle to where now it is mainstream America. I have disposable income. I can buy a big car, fancy car. I can go on a trip to Europe. I can take a cruise. I can buy a second home. I can buy an RV. And it's part of the mix that people look at. I don't think that's changing. I think that's going to continue to grow significantly.
What if that disposable income disappears, though? We've arguably been we have been in the longest bull market in forever, I think, and so there's been a lot of disposable income and a lot of extra money to throw at developments because of super low interest rates and things like that. And so I agree with everything you're saying with camping. I don't think that's ever going to slow down. I think we're in a great position for all the reasons that Jayne said, for all the reasons that I've said before and Ben said before and Kara said before on the show. And you've said before, certainly too, in many conversations with people. So that's not in dispute. Camping is in a great position. I'm just specifically asking about the willingness of banks to extend capital to developers in an industry that arguably a lot of them still don't understand.
If they don't extend it to developers, whether it's real housing or shopping centers or apartment houses or office buildings, they have to put their money out. They have to put their money in play. And over the years, they have become much, much more aware and alert to what the RV park industry is all about.
Yeah.
And so 10 years ago, I would agree with you 100%. It's really risky. They don't know it. But now, because of all of the development and all of the growth in the industry, banks have had to go out and learn about it. And I think that they are much, much more educated than they were. And yeah, there are still obstacles, but there are obstacles for every, banks don't want to lend you money unless you don't need it. If you don't need it, they'll be happy to lend it to you. But that's, investors have this issue all the time. I think it's who knows what the future is going to bring, but I think when the economy turns around, the RV industry is not going backwards at this point. It's only going to go forward, in my view.
I mean, we read stories all the time about new RVers. I was reading one today, there's dealers out there that say 80% of the traffic right now is new RVers. I guess what is the onus on these developers to create resorts that keep these new RVers? I guess it seems like the campground industry is at a part where they're seeing such a flood of new RVers or new campers that they have to work to keep these guys maybe interested in camping. Are you seeing that with developments?
Ben, I agree. I agree with you. This goes way back for me when my parents first bought our campground in New Hampshire, is that way back then, we didn't see any relationships between the campground owners and the RV dealers. The only time we saw them was when we were at a camping show and we said hi to each other. But otherwise, there weren't any real relationships with one another. And I always used to think to myself, there's something wrong with that, because they sell RVs and then these people take their RVs and come to our campgrounds. Why aren't we marketing together? Why aren't we working with this industry? And I really feel that now more than ever, there is a good relationship. I think it can be better and we need to continue to work on it. But more than ever, there are relationships between the dealers and the RV parks that are out there. But it is our responsibility as the campground industry or the RV park industry that if these RVers are out there or these campers are out there, we have to provide to them a quality experience that they want in order to keep camping strong and keep it alive. And that's very, very important, whether it's an older park that needs some upgrades or rehab, whether it's training our staff to give the best customer service experience. I mean, it's not just the physical plant that's important to the entire experience. There's many things that make up the experience. And we have to make sure that we put a product out there that makes people want to continue to camp and wants to trade their rig in for a bigger one to continue camping. And have their future generations want to camp with us.
What's more, almost as equally as important, and I think one of the things we have to watch very carefully is the experiences the newbies have with the RVs they've purchased. I'm not worried about tent campers. I'm worried about, but are people who buy travel trailers and motorhomes of any kind. What is that experience going to be? And I was appalled when, I'm sure you all saw the little note, maybe Ben, in your daily thing last week, about some poor RVer who confused, in a gas station, confused the tank where they store fuel for a dump station, and emptied their gray water or dark black water into a fuel tank in a gas station.
Yeah.
I certainly hope that was the guy's first day out with his RV. But years ago, the RV industry had something called the Care Commission, the RV Care Commission, which was designed to try to help and urge the manufacturers to improve the quality. And what concerns me now is this rush of first-time buyers and the rush of the manufacturers and the dealers to push out more and more units, that there's going to be a disconnect between the newbie buyer and the unit. And they're going to find out that buying an RV, whether it's particularly motorhome, is not the same as buying a car. You don't just, when you have a little problem, you don't just take it back to the dealer and he changes the oil for you. There's a whole lot more that goes with it. And the service angle for a newbie is going to be an eye-opening kind of thing. They don't realize the number of systems in an RV. They don't really understand. It's like their house. You know, water, electric, sewer, all the kind of stuff you have at home. So
that's exactly the reason that I rent my apartment, because I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. So
I know. But we got to be careful that the new buyers understand what they're buying and getting into. The campgrounds, I think, will meet their expectations. I'm more worried about the newbie who comes into the campground and doesn't know how to maneuver, knocks over a tree, or who backs into their pedestal on their site because they have no idea what they're doing. That's the campground side. But I think we got to be real careful that this doesn't backfire somehow on the RV industry, and that a year or two from now, we're not seeing articles about the terrible experiences that people have had with the RVs they bought. We've got to be careful. The RV industry's got to watch that.
So let me pose that question to both you and Jayne, since we're discussing it. If you were counseling these RV manufacturers on, let's say, 3 things that they should be doing that maybe they aren't paying attention to right now, what would those be to avoid those situations?
Training, dealer training, training the dealers to train the buyers. Don't let somebody drive out with an RV until you're sure they understand what they're buying, if they've never owned one. I can tell you that I have some folks down here. I'm out on Lowboat Key, Florida, and I've heard stories from neighbors or friends of theirs who walk into an RV dealership because they want to go see their kids in California, but they don't want to fly. They walk into an RV dealership and they buy a $400,000 motorhome, and they're going to go across the country. They've never owned an RV, and I'm afraid they're the kind of people who are going to dump their waste in the wrong place. They'll think you can pull up on the side of the street, and if there's a sewer outlet or a drainage thing into the sewer system for runoff, they're going to put their hoses down there. So I think there has to be a real intense thing to make sure people don't drive out with RVs if they've never owned one and have no idea what they're getting into, a real lesson kind of thing. Yeah, there was a guy years ago, Jayne, you may remember him. I can't think of his name right now. He worked with Trailer Life and the Good Sam Club to do RV training schools all over, and he would run them all over the country to train people who've never had an RV. But I think the industry's got to get the message out to the new buyers and to the dealers. You have to be really careful, new buyers. You know what you're doing.
And there are webinars on training and dealer training, and also I've always suggested that campgrounds and RV parks escort people to their sites. I think it is a very personal approach, and it's one of the first experiences that the guest has with you, and it is a way to connect with that guest. And if you train your escort staff to be aware of the nonverbal signs of when there might be a problem, they can recognize that. And you can certainly recognize a newbie. You can certainly recognize a brand new rig pulling into your park, and you can certainly say, wow, is this a new rig? And that's all you need to say, and they'll tell you about it. And then you can certainly from there recognize, is this gentleman going to have a problem backing this thing in? And at the parks that I operated and the one that I owned, I never let insurance you know, the tail of the dog, the tail wag the dog. You know, I always used to tell my escort folks, like I had a guy that worked for me, his name was Bob, and Bob was a tractor trailer driver before he retired. So if I had someone who couldn't get their rig in and my escort service knew that, the staff would radio Bob and Bob would jump in and back that in 2 seconds. And many times he'd show the gentleman or the lady that was driving what to do and how to do and give them some tips. I mean, that is an invaluable experience at my campground that's going to make that person come back and back and back and back again, because they're going to always remember that guy Bob who showed them how to back this rig in and back the rig in for them. And I think that that's a very important part of the training when they get to a campsite or get to a campground or get to an RV park.
Yeah,
You know, I just want to read one other thing for a second. I don't want the RV industry to scare people. I just want them to figure out with a good PR campaign how to deal with newbies and make them feel more comfortable. I know I'm thinking about the way maybe is what I said. We don't need to scare away the buyers, and we need to encourage them. And the way I think to encourage them is to let them know they have support. I mean, there is support. Having somebody, if you own a campground, having someone in your campground who knows how to drive a tractor trailer and has done it professionally is great, because you always need somebody to put a fifth wheel into a spot, and nobody does it better than a tractor trailer driver. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. We don't want to scare people, but we need to.
No, I think we're on the same page as you.
Yeah.
Pardon?
I guess my concern is that, you know, I kind of wish, I guess on my end, you know, we already would have some of those systems in place, because it seems like right now would be the great time to be implementing a lot of the stuff that you're talking about.
We're quite fortunate, I am guessing, up here. Our RVDAs offer RV learning weekends in campgrounds all over the place annually that, you know, it's a weekend and there's tons of seminars and, you know, fun stuff too. But they offer, you know, tickets to those events when somebody buys a new RV from a dealership, so that they can come out for the weekend and really get great access to techs and pros and people who know the ins and outs of RVs, but also, you know, then you're gathering with this big group. Sometimes it's 400 or 500 attendees, and so now you're meeting other RVers and getting a ton of access to each other. Those are always great events. I know there's talk now of potentially, you know, starting some online like webinar series, since we can't do those gatherings in place, in person, pardon me. So I think, you know, there's some things. I certainly can't speak for down there, but up here in Canada, we're certainly, you know, there's effort being made on the RV Dealers Association side to really kind of reduce those barriers to entry for new RVers. I know when I owned my park, we had a partnership with the RV rental agencies. So anybody who was renting an RV and wanted to could come to our park for the first 2 nights of their stay for a discounted rate, and then they would send a tech along with them and kind of walk through all of the how to back it in, how to set up all of the connections and all of those things. Those are some unique ways to be help. I mean, hopefully those RV renters are gonna love it so much and go out and buy, right? So lots of ideas to reduce those barriers for sure.
Yeah, and not to say that we don't. I know there's training programs, and I believe the Dealers Association down here does webinars and things like that. It's just hopefully, you know, the dealers are taking part and really, like what Jayne and David had mentioned, guiding them through this process, because it isn't like buying a vehicle. I mean, when you're rolling down the road, there's going to be things that come loose and you're going to have to repair, and it's just all part of the experience, and they just, you know, they need to know that up front. So
hopefully, if you just bought a brand new one, stuff's not going to come loose on your first trip down the road, though.
Brian, that's the problem.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
And,
That is the problem.
and that's the manufacturer's issue.
for sure.
And the horror stories of people's first days out on units are just terrible sometimes. But every buyer of an RV, travel trailer or motor, should have to have a deal, go through the dealer's driving school.
Sure.
If you've never owned and towed a travel trailer behind your SUV, and you think you can back that thing up, anytime, you need to go to driving school. Same thing with a motorhome. I mean, you really need, and it's not just an hour or two, you really have to get somebody out there with you on the road. Imagine a guy who's never driven, a 40-foot bus. All of a sudden, he's got tons of money, and he buys it, and he thinks it's, and he's going to tow a car behind it. You've got to have driving license. I don't care what it is.
That's the same reason I don't own an RV. I'm waiting for the self-driving ones, David.
Exactly. That's it. That'll hold up the sales of RVs for many years, Brian, if you're going to wait for the self-driving RV.
There was an RV dealership near me that did that kind of stuff. I know somebody bought a fifth wheel, and they had a little school that they would take the new buyers through, and he actually had to go through this. It wasn't like a long, exaggerated, like 2-week program or anything, but it was a little school he went to, and he learned how to move his fifth wheel, hook it up, park his fifth wheel, do different things, back his fifth wheel in and stuff. So that was kind of a neat experience for him. I think it made him feel more comfortable. So
I would suggest that every RV dealer have a small area on their lot set up as campsites. And they show people right on there, let them practice backing a unit into a site, whether it's a fifth wheel or a travel trailer or motorhome, and have it with, mock utilities and the sizes and everything. I don't know if any of the dealers have that, but if I were to, I certainly think now that's what they should have to help people really learn. You can't learn sitting, watching it on videos.
It's a good idea. They could have like a crash test bus that people could just ram into things and know what not to do.
And look, over the years I popped the side of a big RV by making a turn too sharp and hitting a fence, and cut a big gash in the RV.
One of our associates does tell me that Lazy Days has a driver training program.
Yeah.
So there's a dealership that does. And I know there's that RV education online that you can do webinars on and so forth. And I do feel that, like Ben said, there are a lot of dealers out there that are training people, helping. But what David's saying is that, doing it a few times in the lot and a training for an hour or so, and then getting out there sometimes are two different things. It takes doing it a few times yourself to really learn. So that's why I think at the campground level, it's important that we're helpful as well, because training is not just this 1 day, 1 hour kind of thing. It's ongoing until you get to the point where you're comfortable with it.
Maybe that's an idea for a future show, Ben. Maybe we could have some RV industry dealer people on to talk about what campgrounds can do and how they can work together and how they can maybe, bring the two sides ideas together.
yeah, I mean, we've heard some really great stories about campgrounds partnering with RV dealerships, and the RV dealers will sell a unit, and they'll get these people into the campground that's nearby, and there's discounts and everything. It works out really well for both ends, and it would be great to talk more about that.
Well, even that, but also spark some of this conversation that David and Jayne are talking about how RV dealers can be more mindful of the experience that comes afterward instead of just the point of sale.
Yeah.
It takes an enlightened dealer to develop those relationships with campgrounds. Campgrounds always want them, but it takes an enlightened dealer, because most dealerships have 3 areas of operation: sales, service, and administrative stuff. They don't have a person devoted to customer training or something like that. And you ask a salesman to go take a couple of hours and go out to a campground to teach one of their customers. Salesman's answer is, if I go out there, I'm going to miss my sales. I'm not into that. I'm a salesman. So you got to have an enlightened dealer and dealership who has the ability to figure out how to do that kind of stuff. Campgrounds love it. I mean, they always have.
Yeah, and they're training more technicians, which is key too to this discussion. I know when people have repair issues, sometimes they have to wait a while to get those repairs. But the RV industry is working to train more technicians, and hopefully that enables them too to help out the customer a little bit more on that end. So. But I guess getting back to the developments part, I guess I was emailed a question by somebody. They were asking, what types of new features, I guess, are you guys seeing at these developments? What are developers looking at maybe putting into these resorts that they haven't in the past that's kind of interesting and catering to maybe new RVers?
So that's a really good question, man. But why are you checking your email during the show? Are you not paying attention to what everybody else is saying?
I check Facebook, email, and Zoom because people contact you no matter how, they just decide to contact you no matter how they can get a hold of you. So text messages, I mean, I probably have like a flying pigeon come in with a note.
You would say on average about 5% of the show you actually consume on a weekly basis?
It's probably like 2.5%. So.
Right. All right, good question though, please.
So I guess, since Brian interrupted it, I'll ask it again.
I think they remember. It's a really good question. Developers and what they're looking for to provide these new consumers with different types of experiences, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of the new developments I've been seeing are more like luxury resorts almost. I mean, we do see some smaller parks or campgrounds that are offering more basic services, but when you get into the larger scale ones, I mean, these things are resorts. I mean, they're offering a ton of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I truly don't think it's a one size fits all type of answer.
Yeah.
That it really, and this is where, if we take a step back, this is where the planning of the development is so important, and understanding the market is very, very important, because there are different campground or RV park business models. There are parks that are vacation destination parks, for instance. So many of the Jellystones fit into that model. So folks are coming there to stay at that property and make a vacation out of it. So the park itself is the destination. There's even, taking it a step further, there's vacation destination camp resorts that are actually in a destination area, right? There are other parks that, like a KOA Journey, for example, that might be right off the highway. So it's going to have different amenities than that vacation destination park. There are other parks that are geared towards snowbirds, or other parks that are geared towards extended stays. And depending upon the model or the type of park that you're building, that is going to help determine what amenities and facilities and services the property should have.
So let me try to rephrase this a little bit and get an answer from you. Let's try something more specific, right? And Ben, you can tell me if I'm headed in the right direction with this, right? There are obviously differences between, for all those reasons that you just mentioned, but there are also things that don't change: Wi-Fi, bathrooms, swimming pools, playgrounds, things like that. So we already know the answer to all those questions. So let me ask something new. There are a lot of new buyers coming in because arguably they know that RVs are a safer experience, right, than flying on a plane, things like that, staying in a hotel. Is there things that you would counsel a developer to do during the planning stage that might assume or might be geared toward the fact that maybe COVID's around for a year or two, or when they actually complete their park? Are there things that they can develop, or strategies they can take, or amenities they can focus on that would be better for the guest both during COVID, but even if COVID is fixed with the vaccine, that just kind of like not booking the middle seat in an airplane, right? That's
Yep,
great for COVID.
absolutely,
It's great.
absolutely. So, and this has been happening in the industry even before COVID. You know, campsites being larger, people being more spaced out, and then, you know, I know even my own parks, they were built many, many years ago when rigs weren't as big and
Oh no.
Oh, we lost Jayne.
you know, I'm sorry.
There you go. You came back. You just cut out for a second.
Oh, sorry. And I know that, you know, in our first park that we bought in the 70s, the previous owner just kind of said, oh, that looks like a good area for a site, and knocked a few trees down, and that was the site, right? And put water and electric in. So for sure, building sites larger, giving people more privacy, unisex bathrooms, or you know, the bathrooms where you go into your own private restroom that usually have toilet, sink, and a shower. Even we're seeing where building a building that has all of those unisex and assigning certain restrooms to certain sites or to even particular sites, and using a code on the door so that you control who actually is going in there. Kiosk type of check-in, so you're not actually walking into a reservation desk, or even having express check-in and having just an attendant that is checking folks in that still has that 6 feet of safety distance between them. So those types of trends were we were seeing that happen. And now it will happen more often because of COVID. We are also seeing, the interesting thing I feel is coming out of COVID is that many people like some of the things that are coming out of COVID. So in other words, I was talking to a campground owner in Indiana the other day, and she said that, you know, now at the pool, they have all the lounges are separated by 6 feet, right? And then she said that they limit the amount of time that people can spend on a lounge so that they can then they will leave, they can clean the lounges, and then the next family can come in and sit and have their time and be 6 feet away from people near them. And she said that the campers are really loving it. And she's thinking she may keep this post-COVID, she may keep this policy in mind, where she originally thought she was going to get a lot of kickback from that. So I think that those type of things, a delivery from the store. So rather than shop, some are even having where you can shop on your app or shop online, making activities, virtual activities. Though I do feel it is good to eventually get back to activities with other people and being outside, but virtual activities. We're seeing a lot more of hiking is coming back, biking is coming back. So there are activities like that. Fishing has always been popular, but it's more popular now. These are the type of things that you're going to see. And also, I put it in quotes, like real camping. You know, let's face it, when we're pulling in our 40-foot motorhome, are we really camping at that point? You know, we could question that. But the resurgence of real camping, of just getting out there and being with nature. And we've seen many parks do it.
Because you're going to knock over trees everywhere. We want to keep them away from the nature part.
Well, we definitely, I've been accused of being a tree hugger before. So when the land planner that is in our group does a very good job of making the development fit into the environment and destroying the land as little as possible in the development of the land. And that's where, if we go back to this planning aspect, which I believe that this was what that webinar was all about, is planning and getting ready to do a new development, is that's why it's so important that the folks that you work with, or even taking it a step, working with folks that know how to take the right steps to do a new development is very, very important. And the land planner is extremely important because a lot goes into that. And really, by taking these steps, not only does it save money, but you end up with a much better looking, working park or new development at the end of the process.
You know, one of the things I've been working on, Ben, you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about new directions for campgrounds. And one of the things, I actually am sort of in the middle of trying to write an article about the return to what Jayne just referred to as real camping. And if you look at the statistics of camping and overnight stays in state parks, there's something there, and state parks are beloved by their people, by residents and citizens. And I think we need to try to figure out how to copy what the state parks magic is in a little bit more developed kind of a process, but using them to look at why people like it. Because of the big sites, because it's spread out, because it's, it's not formal.
Because there's no middle seat, David.
There's no middle seat.
There's no middle seat. That's why they like state parks.
And so when you look at some of the things you can do in a campground, for example, Jayne, I know, has been talking to a lot of our folks about putting in a little pet enclosure on the site. Not we all know dog parks, but if you put a pet enclosure on the site, then that person doesn't have to go walking through the park and encounter other people, and they may want their own privacy. The dog doesn't really need companionship. The dog wants a place to run around. So you can do that on your site. The other thing I think is very critical going forward are the materials. Anybody who's got a park with old wooden picnic tables that are hard to clean and never really get clean, I think need to look at a newer kind of picnic table where you can clean it off, and the benches after somebody has used it. And so, whatever, people are going to become much more health conscious. So something you can spray and wipe off the way you'd clean a sink in a bathroom for the picnic table or something. So I think there's a lot of things.
Isn't that part of the magic of camping, though? Getting the splinter in your finger when you sit down?
Yeah, assuming the splinter doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
That would happen later, and they'd already be happy.
I know they say you can't get COVID through your butt, but who knows? You sit down on a picnic bench, you get a splinter, you may wind up with some problem. And if not COVID, you wind up with an infection in your butt because you got a splinter there. But I think the state parks have a lot to teach us. Yeah. I really do.
Great.
Yeah, definitely. I also wanted to touch a little bit on some of the challenges that developers face. I guess, we read stories all the time. There's some communities that are really open to park developments, and then there's obviously other communities that they don't want you within 100 miles of their community. So I guess when you guys are talking with developers, what's that process like about kind of meeting those challenges, and how do they talk with public officials and get their park built, I guess?
So Ben, that's an excellent question. If you don't mind, I want to start with Kara, because we haven't started with Canada. We haven't discussed Canada and the development things up there. And what you're talking about, you're just asking, is actually super relevant, I feel like, to Canada. Kara, is it not?
Yeah, well, I think we have a really interesting dynamic here right now. We have, really similar numbers to the States in terms of RV sales, and we have a massive site inventory limitation where we really, folks are buying these RVs, but there's nowhere to go camp. Both the public and private campgrounds and RV parks are fully booked already. And then there's, lots of big, giant barriers, regulatory barriers in terms of development. It's incredibly difficult in a lot of areas in this country to access permitting, and going through that process alone. The zoning process and then the permitting process often takes a few years before you can even start to look at, doing anything in terms of building a campground. So it's a huge commitment. And so we're seeing sale of already developed properties happening a lot. Developers are purchasing existing campgrounds. But obviously that's not helping our site inventory issue. Lots of developers are adding sites where they can. I know in my park, we had 30 tent sites when we inherited it, and had to go through a process to convert those to 50 amp RV sites. And just getting permitting and those kinds of things took over 2 years, and the project itself took 8 months. So the governmental regulatory stuff is a huge hurdle that's deterring developers from building new parks in this country. And I don't know if it's a result of officials not really understanding the business very well, and I think what you were saying about oftentimes your communities aren't overly welcoming of this kind of business model. So there can be barriers there too, but definitely the site inventory issue is gonna make things difficult, not only for dealers but the manufacturers as well. We're gonna start seeing, I'm already hearing all the time that people I'm not gonna go buy an RV or upgrade my RV because I can't go camping anywhere. There's no sites for me to book.
Yeah. I'm just getting to that site inventory question. I know we've talked, I've spoken with some people that mention that there's more than enough sites, but that it's not the sites that people want. So maybe the sites near national parks. I guess, do you guys agree with that sentiment, or is there just a basic inventory lack of sites?
I'll agree with that. I think generally folks tend to really flock to those public parks, the federal and provincial parks here. They're beautiful. The scenery is stunning. They're incredibly inexpensive compared to, our private campgrounds and RV parks. They're charging $15 or $20 a night for a site compared to 50 or 60 in a private park. So yeah, those sites definitely fill quickly. We see the reservation systems for those sites open in January or February online, and sites book the entire season, books within hours usually in those parks. So I think there certainly are private campgrounds that are doing some really great unique things to compete with those markets, but yeah, I would definitely agree that I think there's a certain demographic that wants that federal park experience where you're really kind of remote. Lots of people who don't want Wi-Fi while they're camping or whatever, right? Those guys want to disconnect, and so that's why they're seeking out that type of camping experience. And so they just don't bother booking in a private park. So you're right, the different business models like we were talking about earlier really impact occupancy levels based on demographic, I think.
Well, I wasn't even just talking about the public parks either. I'm talking about, like, I think the private parks around some of these locations get filled up really fast too. If you've got a private park near Yellowstone, there's a bunch of them. I think a lot of those parks get filled up really quickly. So, I guess if you're a new RVer and you want to go to Yellowstone, you should have probably planned a year ago. Because I think a lot of those places take 6 months to a year advanced reservations. So it's always curious to me, and I guess Jayne, David, what you can jump in too, as to whether there's actually not enough RV sites or whether there's just not enough RV sites at the places people want to go. So.
Well, it's probably, I don't think it's much different in the hotel business. If you
Yeah.
want to get a hotel room around Yellowstone during the summer, you better make reservations way out front, or go during the winter. And it's the same thing in Florida. If you want to be in Florida and Southern California and Arizona during the winter, you have to plan ahead. But if you want to go during the summer, you're welcome to come. And in the Northeast, I think it's, if you want reservations on weekends, you better make them ahead of time. But I'm pretty sure, Jayne, I don't know what's going on up in your area now, in New Hampshire and so on, but it always was midweek, you could almost get a reservation anywhere, except, if you're in Bar Harbor, Maine, and, midweek is going to be just as tough as weekends.
Yeah.
If you're at Disney, when it was running full blast, during the peak times, midweek was the same. But if you're in other areas, that are different kind of business models, it's a whole different thing. So, and that's the reason the national parks and the state parks go up, is they have this reputation as a great place to just go for a vacation. And the cost is always an issue. And the state parks have always been able to underprice, or not underprice, at least price less than the commercial parks. So it's there are places, yes, where there are lack of sites. You want to get a winter site for a month in Florida, it's hard to find in a reasonably good park. If you don't care where you go, you'll eventually find something. If you want to find a park in Florida for 2 weeks, that's not easy, because so many of the parks are filled with monthlies and or seasonal. So it's a matter of, every park keeps a few sites open for short term, but they fill up during the peak seasons. So you got to know, you really got to know what you're doing when you build that park in a particular area. What do you need to build to fit that market that you want to go after? And that's really the work that Jayne does and our land planner does, to make sure you're building the right thing, not overbuilding and overdeveloping more than you should. And Jayne, when was the last time somebody called you and said, I think I want to build a medium income, middle level campground or RV park?
No, most of the time the calls are, we want to build a luxury RV park. And I always say to them, you want to build a modern quality RV park. And then they say, yes, yes, yes. And
nobody ever calls and says, I want to build a middle of the road kind of campground.
Yeah. And, I do think that you can argue that there is already a shortage of modern RV sites out there. I think that could be argued. And just in general, for sure in the areas of the country where where Yellowstone or, vacation areas during their peak time, for sure. But just in general, throughout the country, with the amount of RVs that the manufacturers are making and the dealers are selling, and people in their first 3 years of ownership have the highest usage, and then with what happens with used units, because remember, the more new RVs they sell, the more used units there are out there. So all of this is creating this demand for modern campsites, and I do think that there's a shortage of those.
Agreed.
Well, I know, getting back to the regulatory stuff, you guys have developers come to you all the time. I guess, what do developers need to do to just prepare themselves to deal with local officials? And what's your best advice you give to them as far as putting their plans together and presenting them to like communities and local officials?
To not rush it. Haste makes waste. We get these calls lots of times, like, we need you to do this done and get this done, and the timeline is 30 days. And I just had this discussion with the client. It's really important we can't just, it's really important to go in there with all of your ducks in a line, let's say, and to make the best impression that first time in. And that means, to me, that means not going in there too soon until you have it together. You know, you are at the beginning stages, you are very much marketing. And again, let's put that in quotes. You're marketing this project to some kind of board, right? Some kind of council that needs to accept this development. And there will be some folks on that council or on that committee or on that board who think they know how to build an RV park, and they probably don't, but they'll think they do. And they'll be a camper, so they think they know. But there's others that don't even know anything about camping. So again, it goes into educating them so they understand the right stuff and don't come in with any like preconceived notions of what it should be. And then also coming in with the proper plans or drawings that show them, because people in general don't have the right imagination, you know, showing them it's why they stage a home rather than show a home that doesn't have anything in it. Because for most of us, we can't imagine in our heads what it should really look like. It's coming in with the right plan and remembering that you've got to first sell them. You've got to first market to them before you then are going to sell it to the public or market to the public. And this is where we strongly feel that developers get into trouble, because once you go in and you make the wrong impression, then it's much harder to go back the next time. And so taking that time at the beginning and following the steps that I'll say we recommend or another professional recommend, I find is very, very important. And many times when we talk to new developers who have not done this in the camping industry, we need to slow them down a little bit and really let them understand what the steps are. And once they do understand the steps, it makes good sense to them.
You know, what it really comes down also is almost, you know, most pieces of land around the United States are zoned for certain kinds of uses. So the first thing we always say to somebody who wants to develop a park, a developer, is what's the zoning on the property now? And will that zoning allow you to do what you want to do? Or do you have to change the zoning? And if you have, and developers are used to that, they understand. So if you have to change the zoning, there's a lot of upfront soft costs, which you may never recoup. Or you have to, before you can get the zoning changed, you have to have the plan, the feasibility study that tells you what to build, so you can develop a site plan to go to a council and say, I want to change the zoning on this property so I can do this. And here's my plan. And show them that. And that's expensive to do. And for folks who've never done development, that's an obstacle. For people who are used to doing development, they understand that every project has soft costs going in that you may or may not recover. If your plan doesn't sell and you can't convince. So not only do you have to plan, but you have to have an understanding of who your neighbors are and what they think, and how do you go and talk to the neighbors to let them know what you're doing. You got to be careful because you don't want to spook them until you have to. But B, you want to get an idea whether or not they're acceptable to it. Now I know here I tried to buy an unused shopping center on Longboat Key, Florida, and my idea was to knock it down and build on Longboat a luxury RV resort. And I knew, everybody I talked to said the town commission would never, ever allow an RV park on Longboat Key. And I went and I started to talk with some of the town commissioners, and out of half of them I talked to told me that, save your money, David, save your breath, save your time. It's never going to happen. One or two of them would say, well, we'll take a look at it. Unfortunately, the shopping center sale fell through, so it didn't go, but you've got to be sure who your neighbors are. And, you know, if you have a housing community next door, or even a half a mile away, that's $500,000-$600,000 homes. And you tell them you want to build an RV park a mile from their place. You know, you have to get over what is known in the world as NIMBY, not in my backyard. You know, I love RVs, I love RV parks, I love to go camping, but you're not going to build it in my backyard. So those are just some of the obstacles that really, you know, come in the way. It's a lot better now than it used to be, because a lot more of the commissioners know people, either RV owners themselves or campers, or they know people who are. So in the last 10 years, you know, you can always amount, somebody on the town commission is going to know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a little, but that lead up to doing the right steps before you step into the hard stuff is very critical.
Is that similar in Canada, Kara? I guess is, you know, what, you know, is that, do you hear that from developers at all as far as those steps they need to take or the obstacles?
You know, like I said, I tried to reach out looking for some development companies to even talk with about this and really come up empty-handed. I mean, there's not a ton of new park development happening. The folks that I know of who are building parks now are private individuals who've kind of are making this leap on their own. I know a couple of couples who, a husband and wife, and really want the lifestyle for themselves. And they're going up against, you know, town councils and those kinds of things on their own without any sort of representation or experience doing this in the past. It is a huge barrier. Having the type of knowledge that's required to, you know, present a business plan to in an environment like that is, you know, not everybody's strong suit. Certainly some of them have been successful. And I think I'm hopeful that will grow as we're really, like David said, the demographic of RVing, people who are accessing RVing is really growing and becoming so much more broad. And yeah, there's a better understanding of the industry. I think, you know, current events right now in terms of camping being so in the news is also going to help. I think it'll make folks who maybe don't understand the industry see in a clearer light that, you know, it's a really viable business and generally does great things for communities and things like that. But yeah, I think we have a bit of a ways to go up here in Canada in terms of getting to a place where development of new parks is less of a undertaking. I had a member of the association join. She's spent 5 years working on development access, and they just turned her down. So she's sitting on, you know, 40 acres of land. She had business planning and all kinds of things in hand, and they refused her. Those things are devastating, and I hope we can overcome them.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. You know, a lot of these things also apply to expansion.
Agreed.
If you want to expand your park, a couple of things happen before you decide you're going to do it. In some places, if your park is zoned okay and it's a conditional use permit, if you want to make a change to the park, it could open up look at all the conditions that you're currently operating under. And you have to make sure that if you have extra land, that land is covered under the same permit that your original park is covered under. And sometimes if they reopen the examination of the whole thing, you wind up with some things you didn't think you were going to have. It's like, remodeling a house in a floodplain. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to meet today's codes. So if you're going to add on to your park, and your park was built 30 years ago, you may have to look at upgrading the whole park to our local codes for today. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So that's another thing is expansion isn't always as easy as it just putting the tractor into the woods and cutting out a few more sites.
That happened to me firsthand when we did our expansion. Our county required that we upgrade all of the electrical wiring for the rest of the other 200 sites in my park had to be upgraded to match the standards, electrical standards of the new sites.
So,
one of the things we always tell, by the way, excuse me 1 second, Ben, I have one last comment and I'm going to shut up. Is we always suggest to people who call us, usually they call us and say, I have a piece of property under contract and I've got 30, 60, 90 days to close on it. What do I do? Our general advice is jump into the zoning right away before you close on that contract, or make sure the contract has a clause in it that allows you to hold the property and take it off the market for what may be a year or two of a permitting process and a zoning process. So, and sellers are usually, if they have big pieces of property, they're aware of that. If it's not zoned the right way for the best use, I'm going to have to hold this for the contract until it, with a clause that says if I can't get my zoning, I'm out. And maybe the seller will assess, some kind of a fee, $25,000, $30,000, $40,000, and say, if you can't get it, that's, you forfeit that fee. So we got to watch out for that.
As a newspaper journalist, I sat through a lot of zoning meetings, and the one thing they are not very quick processes. So they take their time, and especially when you're looking at an RV park and campground, I imagine they have a lot of public members show up and give their opinions. So
the neighbors.
Yep. Yep. So
we know them as a butters or butt.
It's always amazing too, for anybody that's been through the zoning process, what makes people upset sometimes. Sometimes it's like things that you would think would make them upset don't make them upset, and then other things that you think, oh, this is going to breeze through, it's like it brings out hundreds of people, and it's just amazing sometimes.
That is true.
Go ahead, Jayne. No,
I've experienced that firsthand, Ben, is that you anticipate certain problems and you get prepared for those, and then all of a sudden nobody even cares, and then all of a sudden something else comes up that you didn't even think was on anyone's radar. And I do also think that it's really important, education to these committees and these planners and zoning folks, because sometimes you go into a planning board and there isn't even a campground ordinance or campground zoning. So it's a little bit of the Wild West, you're blazing a new trail. And so sometimes you need to help educate them on certain things that we do in the industry. Say, for instance, rentals, which typically for many parks are park models. And, the planning and zoning boards sometimes look at that as like you're building buildings, and sometimes you want to do stick-built rentals, but many times you're really just bringing in park models, which are RVs, but they don't understand that. So there's some education involved sometimes, and you need to be aware of that, and then you need to educate them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I'm good. She made my point.
You've been quiet for so long. It's amazing. I didn't even know you could be this quiet.
I can. I just listen and I react. So.
Well, I think we're
You have
ready.
a lot of time, Ben. Like, how long do you plan on keeping this going?
Yeah, I think we're ready to wrap this up. Thanks, Jayne, for coming on, and David for
You're
joining.
welcome.
It was a really good discussion. I mean, I think we learned a lot, and I know the audience is gonna really enjoyed it, and I'm sure, they'll come back and hopefully watch all of it on the recording if they didn't get a chance to watch all of it today. So, thanks again, and thanks Brian and Kara for coming back and putting up with me. So I know that's a challenge week to week. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks everyone who's watching, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.